I'm happy to introduce our third keynote speaker, Simon O'Sullivan, professor of art theory and practice at Goldsmiths College, University of London, focusing on how fiction and myth shape subjectivity and world-making. His publications include, most recently, From Magic and Mythwork to Care and Repair, The Ancient Device, On Theory, Fiction and Other Genres, and in collaboration with David Burrows, Fictioning the Myth Functions of Contemporary Art and Philosophy. He is also part of the performance collaboration collective Plastique Fantastique. Today, Simon will be presenting his paper, Writing, Performance and Mythwork. I give the floor to you, Simon. Thank you.
So I can't see the audience if I don't wear my glasses, but I can't read my paper. So if I look blankly at you, that's the reason. There's also going to be a bit of a shuffling of hands because I've got to try and do the computer, the control, and the mic, and my right hand's not very dexterous. So thanks to the organisers for this great conference. It's been a great 2 days, really thought-provoking for me. So many different ideas. I'm really pleased, particularly to be part of that last panel. It was really great to be part of that. And I'm really pleased to be able to talk a bit about some new work, or newish work. It's kind of 3 books that I published all at the same time. And I've not really spoken about the 3 of them before, so it's great to kind of reflect and revisit that. And they're all about performance and writing and what I call mythwork, or the making of fictions, the constructing of narratives, the claiming of authorship. And I think they're all to do with the fiction of the self, or the fiction we have of ourselves, and how to get some perspective on that, or how to work with that. What else to say? Yeah, I'm hoping that what I offer will have some traction with some of you. I mean, it feels a bit like a kind of report back from a scene that I'm part of in London and the South Coast and Goldsmiths, and I'm hoping it might have some traction. Okay, how do I turn it on? I've got it. So I'm going to introduce these 3 research projects that all became books. I don't know why that is. I think I just work better on long-form writing projects. In a way, that's how I kind of work best. They tend to have a kind of 4 or 5 year lead in, and it's something about being involved in a project that I have a relationship with over time that kind of speaks back to me. Sometimes colleagues at Goldsmiths say, how come do you write so many books? And I sort of write to survive. I get up in the morning before the kids get up, and I start writing. And it's a way for me to kind of make sense of things, to gather resources, to understand where I am. So this is the 3rd of the books that I'm going to come to last. It's on theory fiction, and it's involved. It goes through different forms of writing, and it's the one I'm going to come to towards the end of my talk if I've got time. If I haven't got time, I'm just going to end with the first 2 projects. So do give me a nod at 45, 50 minutes. So these are the other 2 books that I wrote first. One's called From Magic and Mythwork to Care Repair. The other one's called The Ancient Device. And they're both connected. And when I was writing them, I kind of thought about them as the same book, the same research project, almost as if they were the same book concerned with the same thematics, but operating on 2 different registers. One on the register of fiction, that's The Ancient Device, and one on the register of, well, theory, I guess. Or actually, I thought of them more as The Ancient Device operates through images and scenes and sequences, and the care of the the magic as Mythwork was more to do with developing concepts, so images and concepts really. And they both reflect on this idea of the fiction of the self, or how the fiction we have of ourselves and how that might be played with, at least to some extent, and the relationship of that to writing, performance, and landscape. Landscape was a particularly important thing for both these books, both a real landscape out there and also an imaginary landscape, an internal landscape, and the relationship between the two, actually, of those. So the cover of this book is by Tom O'Sullivan and an artist called Amory Copstake, and they let me borrow the image. And it's an image of the Fulton drums. And the Fulton drums make an appearance in the book, and in fact, they make an appearance in the Mythwork book too. They're important objects for me, or props, or devices that trigger certain things. Not least writing, actually. And they also operate, for me, as a kind of temporal anamorphosis. So you probably know the concept of anamorphosis. It's a kind of image function, really. It's a kind of something, it's usually thought about in relation to kind of painting, actually. And the classic example is Hans Holbein's The Ambassadors, where you have these two Renaissance men of learning surrounded by the tools of their trade. And then in the bottom of the painting, you have this smear or this blot or this void that makes no sense. And it's only when you leave the room, as it were, and look back, so you're occupying a different posture, that you see what the blot or the smear or the void is, and it's a kind of skull. So one perspectival system has to go out of perspective in order for another one to come into being. And yeah, actually, when I was hearing Jack's paper on our architecture, I was thinking actually anamorphosis is an interesting example of a kind of a void or a hole that's also another world if you change your posture and perspective on it. Anyway, I thought of these objects as temporal anamorphosis. If you have a certain position to them, they summon a world or they summon a different time. And I think for me, writing and what I'm calling mythwork requires these kind of props and triggers. I need these kind of things to get me going. So these drums are in the British Museum in London. They were found in a child's burial in Fulton, a little village in North Yorkshire. And they were buried with a child, a 12-year-old. One of the drums, the bigger drum, was buried next to the head. The other drum was buried at the hips. And the last drum was buried at the feet. They're quite a rare example of kind of Neolithic objects, certainly the British Isles, that have features on them, faces. In fact, they're more or less unknown in the British Isles. You do have, in Europe, you do have some examples, but they're certainly an enigma, and there's been different theories written about them. The most recent theory, actually, is that you tie a bit of a string around them, and they operate as measuring devices. For example, in the landscape, to measure out henges and standing stones. But for me, they're clearly vessels or entities, and they've got something to do with grief, for me, grief work, because they're buried with that child. But anyway, they're devices from a landscape of the past that are now in my landscape and have meaning for me. Actually, sometimes when I go to Goldsmiths where I teach, but that's another story, teach at the moment, when I've got a bit of time on my hands, I go back to look at them in the British Museum. They've kind of like reeled me in. I just stand in front of them, in front of the glass, and look at them. I don't really know what they are for me, but they seem to operate as devices or openings or kind of triggers, something. I've written about them elsewhere as kind of time travel devices. and I've also used them as props in teaching. So the central story of the ancient device, it has a narrative of sort, concerns these cast of characters or avatars: Ribbonhead, Fox Owl, King John, Hare, each of whom are somewhat broken, bedraggled, and looking for an escape from where they are. And we meet them on the road, travelling to a site in a landscape where there's going to be a performance of some kind. So these characters or avatars are loosely based on the performance fiction Plastique Fantastique, which I'm part of. And these figures or characters or avatars, these composite figures, they travel or they track across different regimes and genres. So from here, they travel from performance, that's me as Fox Owl at the Wising Arts Centre, into writing. But I think the ancient device, the book, is a performance itself of sorts. Certainly in the book, a mumming play is presented as a script within a book. So again, there's a mixing up of genres. And this is something I'm particularly interested in, smearing genres or moving from different genre to genre. But the idea of acting and acting as if is present throughout the book, and actually Plastique Fantastique as well. Actually, when I talked to David about this, we see it as a kind of magical technology. Act as if this is the case and see what happens. Something happens at the end of the play in the book, and the characters descend into a second narrative, one that's darker, more mythic, and broadly speaking, therapeutic in character. So here the idea of the fiction of the self, the image we have of ourselves, the narrative we tell ourselves and others, is explored in more detail, and this idea of repair becomes important. So I've become increasingly interested in this idea of care and repair and practice, partly because of my own experiences, going through a brutal redundancy process, my struggles with mental health, seeing my students' struggles with mental health, and trying to think about how my practice of writing and performance and my teaching might be part of a practice of care and repair. So you can probably tell with this piece of fiction and the inclusion of the scripts and the references to therapy or a therapeutic logic, the book plays with presentation and plays with different genres. The later parts of this book involve the presentation of different scenes and images, some of which are from the different perspectives of these invented characters, alongside a series of kind of resolutions. But part of the book's intention is to play around with causal effect, trying to unpick temporal sequencing, trying to reverse cause and effect. And this is another thing that I've become increasingly interested in, this idea of retroactive causation, of things already being there in the future and kind of almost like hurling back lines, leading you to it. And I think this relates to writing. I'm going to come back to this idea that these things are in the future waiting. And as I said, throughout this book, the idea of a landscape that's both external, internal, and real and dreamlike and imaginative is crucial to this journey. So again, there's references with my own performance group. That's the more or less, not all of us, but some of Plastique Fantastique at the, blimey, what's that? Dilston Grove in London, which is a gallery in South London. So as well as this play with presentation and different genres, I think the ancient device is a work of fiction and even an experiment in life writing or auto writing, although I don't think it's really about exploring myself, my biography. It's about kind of stretching that out into a landscape and looking at what figures and what objects occupy that landscape and seeing where they go, seeing what information they might want to offer me. I think that's what the project was about. So this particular writing project, The Ancient Device, arises from this MA course I teach in Goldsmiths on art writing and theory fiction, and also one on occulture, the relationship between magical practice and art practice, which looks at these new hybrid genres emerging in the critical humanities and the arts, and contemporary art especially, and the way fiction's increasingly deployed as a kind of method within that. So I'll say more about that when I get to the third part of my talk, if I get there, if I don't go on any tangents. So that course encouraged students to conduct their own myth work. They would do pilgrimages to certain sites in the landscape. They would produce fanzines. Some would do performances. There was a sense in which there was a kind of using different components to construct imaginary landscapes and construct self-narratives. Some of these ideas about myth work and how fiction can be part of a practice were from an ongoing idea or concept called fictioning, about the instantiation or materialisation or enactment of fictions within reality, and which resulted actually in this co-authored monograph with David Burrows, who's also a key figure of Plastique Fantastique with me. He's at the Slade just up the road. So this was a collaborative piece of writing, and yeah, I don't know if any of you have done collaborative writing, but it's a very painful process. This was like a 5-year project that was very difficult because you come up against the limits of yourself. You have to deal with another subjectivity, and it's very challenging, but incredibly rewarding because, of course, you produce something that you couldn't have produced on your own. You produce this kind of third thing between you. And it's a very enriching and kind of important thing. So this book tracks through this idea of fictioning or enacting fictions in the world through 3 different points or gathering poles, as we understood them, where we gathered different practices together. The first was mythopoesis, which we saw as the creation of worlds, and following Deleuze, the summoning of a people. There was the second section was on myth science, which we thought about in terms of exploring different perspectives, and Sun Ra was our key figure there. And the last section, which was on mythotechnesis, and this is the way the human-machine collaboration could produce and open up other fictions and other modes of being. So both David and I were not of the school of lamenting technological developments that you can get with some Frankfurt School philosophy and BIFO, for example. We were very, very interested in the way machines can be used to open up incorporeal universes. You know, they can be used to kind of open up all sorts of possibilities. A further rationale of this project and also the ancient device is that some inquiries, such as an inquiry into the fiction of the self, the fiction we have of ourselves, require a fictional mode of writing. And I think storytelling and fiction can be a way of obliquely engaging with this and also conducting this repair work. This is especially the case when fiction involves the laying out of different images and once again landscapes that cross over from art into life and help cohere a sense of self. So, yeah, I was very taken with Jack's talk about destitution and staying with the cut, staying with the wound, staying with the void, and not seeking to build on that. But consistency is important to me in order to be able to go on, to be able to keep going on. I need a consistency. I need to kind of hold myself together, if you like. My take on this, with collaboration with David and the ancient device, is sometimes we can produce or write something that then speaks back to us as if it came from somewhere else. We produce something that's of us, but not of us exactly, or gives us some kind of information. And I suppose I feel that this is a key thing about art practice, and it's why Plastique Fantastique is really important to me, as well as writing practice. It allows me to be involved with something that speaks back. that gives me information. The other key rationale, as I've already said, is this exploration of performance in different ways. What is performance? What does performance art allow? This is a character called Twiglet that we summoned at Wising, at the Wising Art Centre. So sometimes with these performances, it's a question of channeling. It's almost like you try and get yourself out of the way so that something behind you can speak. And I think that's increasingly kind of what we were doing with Plastique Fantastique. We were trying to allow different fictions to get up and speak and say their thing. Sometimes even these composite characters, like this one. So often these performances involved audiovisual work, props, objects, various electronic devices, samplers, drum machines, mics. It's a collective performance that produces something different for ourselves, but perhaps for any participant too. It's not for an audience, but I'm hoping something resonates. I mean, I thought Martin's comments about the aesthetic event, not knowing what the outcome is, and the notion of indetermination, I think that's a kind of a way in to think about how we understand Plastique Fantastique. But this book is also a performance in itself, just in a different genre. Whilst writing it, I thought of the book as itself a kind of device, a kind of anamorphic object that gets activated when it's in the right place or when it finds the right reader. So pulling back from this kind of work, this laying out of the self as a landscape with figures, or inventing these figures that might be on that landscape, is what I call, again, mythwork. Writing out and claiming one's own narrative. And I think that also involves some work of care. Well, that's a kind of academic take, not really academic, but a kind of academic take on what that was all about. But in fact, I'm not really sure what that book was. I wanted it to work as a piece of standalone fiction. I didn't want to overdetermine it. It started with a dream and then an object. Is it successful? Well, there's been a lot of silence and confusion, a big kind of silence when I put it out there. One of those career-ending books. But then a few people resonated with it strongly. Interestingly enough, it was often people not in academia and not in art, but people in role-playing games, therapeutic setups, different kind of ecologies that sort of got it, or kind of were really enthusiastic about it. So much so that actually a group of them are going to put on a performance based on it. So that would make sense to me, because it was written as a kind of exploration of the fiction of the self and as a kind of therapeutic process, or perhaps an aesthetic therapeutic process. Life writing, or writing as survival. Seeing where my imagination might go. Yeah, just some people, you know, it was like, got the frequency of it somehow. Book number 2. So this is the second book, and it's much more straightforward, a work of theory, although there are bits of fiction in this too, or bits of theory fiction and auto-writing in it. Each chapter ends with kind of a piece of fiction or a kind of piece of writing from my own life. I wanted to write a book where I was exploring the fiction of the self that I had and looking at devices that had been important to me. I wanted to write it for my students. I wanted to write a book that kind of showed my struggles, but also where I'd found my resources, where I'd found the components to build devices that allowed me to keep going. It's composed of 14 short essays that I wrote either during or immediately after writing the ancient device. So they're kind of parallel. And you get a sense of what it does if you look at the different chapters. The first of the essays, don't worry, I'm not going to go through all of them. The first of the essays, Avatars, Egregores, and the Writing of the Self, was the one that was most closely aligned with that fiction, the ancient device, and with the various devices that are in play with that piece of fiction. It was the first of the essays to be written, and it arose directly from reflections I had when I was writing that piece of long-form fiction. In fact, the whole book arose from kind of notes I was making as I was writing the fiction. And suddenly I had this collection of ideas that I thought, well, I've got to write these things out and see where they go. So that book is also about how we unmake and then make ourselves, or even how we might claim or produce our own subjectivities, how we might be involved in some kind of self-authorship, which is what I think I was also doing with the ancient device, or trying to do with the ancient device. Now, this is an image from Plastique Fantastique, the performance fiction. We do drawings and comics and installations and performances, and this is one of them. Some of you will recognise the RSI Lacanian diagram from the late writings of Lacan, the real, the symbolic, and the imaginary, and that's Lee Bowery in the middle there. There's a synthome, a knot that ties those three registers together. So in this Mythwork book, From Magic and Mythwork to Care and Repair, I track through some psychoanalytic and schizoanalytic resources and methods, especially from Lacan's seminar on the ethics, which was a really important book for me. And Lacan says in that book on the ethics that the goal of psychoanalysis is to become a cause of oneself, to claim one's own determination. Which has resonances with Spinoza as well, this idea of claiming your own determination. And the other resources were the later writings about the RSI, the real, the symbolic, and the imaginary, these three registers of the subject, and how for some people they're not knotted together, the RSI, they drift apart, and therefore a new knot is needed to tie them together, and that new knot is known as the synthome. And it's a practice or a process or an object that helps tie these different knots together. And I think in a way, that's what Mythwork is, or certainly for me. Certainly writings like that and performance. It's a way of tying those knots together and giving me consistency as a subject. And also, I think the same is at play with Plastique Fantastique. So here again, repair is about trying to produce a knot. Maybe it's a bit like, I don't know if you know the Japanese art kitsungu, where you have a broken ceramic pot. Do you know that kind of practice? You know, when the pot is shattered and then it's mended with gold. But you see the repairs, you see the lines. So it's not a return to normality. It's not kind of making a fully functioning ego. It's kind of holding those kind of moments of breakage and fracture together. Thank you. That's all I've got time for. Rapid. Can anyone up there sort that out? Great. I'll see if I can go through and get to that next image. Yeah, so the other book that was really important to me, another book that's really important to me is the Chaosmosis by Felix Guattari. I first came across this a long time ago in the kind of early 90s, and I couldn't make head and a tail of it. It was like some sort of piece of future right from the future. It kind of felt like science fiction, but it's been a really important book for me. It's where Guattari maps out his aesthetic paradigm, talks about the production of subjectivity, talks about aesthetic rupture and so on, and that became also important for the Mythwork book. I took a lot of things from Guattari about how we might produce ourselves, how we might be able to break with one regime and produce through another one. And then I also draw resources from these two books. I apologise that this is a bit of a survey of kind of things that I've kind of been interested in, but it's interesting for me to look back on why I looked at these. So this is the Capitalism and Schizophrenia project from Deleuze and Guattari. And yeah, they've just been key texts for me, kind of anti-Oedipus in terms of that laying out of what the subject is. The subject is just a residuum or a kind of side effect of a machinic process of desiring production, and 1,000 plateaus, well, for all sorts of different reasons, but maybe particularly in relation to the possibilities of transformation and becoming. And then another book that was really important, this is one of them, a couple of books, is Thomas Metzinger's The Ego Tunnel, and particularly his work on neuroscience and the idea of the nemocentric subject, or experience without a subject, or how we can be in the world without a subjectivity. I think this is kind of hovering around a little bit with the panel, this idea of another mode of being in the world without a subjectivity, without an identity, and what that might be like. And Thomas Metzinger explores that through talking about lucid dreaming and various kind of neuroscientific experiments. So it was very interesting for me to bring that into relationship with Deleuze and Guattari. This is all in this chapter on avatars and egregores and the fiction of the self. Avatars, egregores, this idea of entities, magical entities that you conjure into existence by an investment of energy, keep feeding them. Fictions that you feed, like Plastique Fantastique, that you feed and then have their own agency in the world, start speaking back to you as if they're from elsewhere. So this idea of fictions that might take on a reality, it has resonances with some of Isabel Stenger's work, not this book actually, but kind of her work on animism and being compromised by magic, and how we might come into relationship with magic by understanding it as fictions that have an effect in a given milieu. That was a very important concept for me. Fictions that kind of have a real effect in a given milieu. And then the Cybernetic Culture Research Unit, which I don't feel I need to introduce to this particular audience because it's interesting they've been kind of hovering around this group from Warwick of kind of renegade academics. But their idea of hyperstition, the idea of the production of fictions that then take on a reality and have an impact on that reality, or kind of fictions working in different ways to enact a certain kind of reality, that became important too. So many of the essays in that first section of that book, the first part of the book, they return to and develop some of this material in that first essay, and they're all around these ideas of writing, magical practice, and once again, the fiction of the self. And at the same time, they increasingly develop this idea of the device, I became obsessed with this idea of devices, props, triggers, devices. And as is my wont, when I'm not performing or writing, I like to draw diagrams. So I tried to draw a diagram of how I was understanding these different devices, or a plane of different devices. So that flat plane is the plane of different devices, whether they're technical objects, scientific devices, religious devices, aesthetic devices, different objects and props. And I became interested in this idea of that, you see that eye up there, the kind of perspective looking down, which is often the theoretical perspective, looking down on that field of devices and doing a theoretical analysis. I became really interested in dropping that down to become one more device on that field of devices, rather than a position theoretically explaining it. And actually, that device helped me think through the writings of another character that was very important to me, Francois Laruelle, and his project of non-philosophy. And it helped me think through how Laruelle's project was trying to change perspective on philosophy, so it wasn't an all-inclusive cavalryman's perspective on the real interpretations, but you drop down that perspective onto a field of what he calls philo-fictions. So you're repurposing conceptual resources as almost like philo-fictional devices. It's a kind of radical democracy there. It's almost like kind of knocking the cavalryman off the horse so they come down onto that field of devices. Diagrams are interesting for me. They allow me to do all sorts of things. Elsewhere, I played around with diagramming concepts, literally laying them out on a tabletop, and then seeing what compatibilities and syntheses might be allowed to representing them diagrammatically. That's become a really important creative process for me in terms of dealing with conceptual material. I've mentioned Laruelle already. Diagramming was really important to this work on the production of subjectivity. In fact, that book is really about refiguring different philosophers' concepts in relation to these diagrams and putting them together. So, for example, that diagram on the cover is an upside-down Bergsonian cone of memory plugging into Lacan's torus from the Ethics of Psychoanalysis. But I'm laughing there because the interesting thing for me about that is that's also Plastique Fantastique's making of a large glass, a bit like Duchamp's glass that we put in a gallery. So again, I hadn't thought about this, but again, it's the way it moves genres. You know, these things move genres, and how that, I don't know, it's just very, very interesting how that works. So this work on Mythwork, from magic and Mythwork to care and repair, also circulates around key figures and practices and fictions that have been important for my own Mythwork, which means, you know, there are various repetitions and refrains, and I think this looping around and this layering of references is important to Mythwork. I suggest that in some of the essays in the book and some of the case studies I look at, insofar as it involves this intense relationship with one's materials, constant return back to them, and then a back again, and another inflection on them. You know, there's a kind of circulation of key texts and key figures that one keeps coming back to. Same themes, but from different resources. But that book also operates as a kind of gathering of resources for, I started thinking, well, is this kind of idea of Mythwork, is it a larger kind of field of practices? And I started gathering other practices. For example, this is an image from Sophie Slade Johnson's Cida Viella, which was, Sophie Slade Johnson's a kind of artist from Southend She made a pilgrimage into the marshes to a sacred site, actually a well, actually, and then did a kind of certain kind of ritual performance there, and then restaged that ritual in a gallery in Peckham, of all places. She had the crozier made. That's from the carving on the stone there, and there was a kind of activation of that scene across space and across time. It's a really curious, compelling performance. So in one of the chapters of the book called Magic and Place, I write about C.D. Viella and how Sophie Leigh Johnson's practice activates the landscape and activates different temporalities caught in the landscape, layers of kind of different times and different events. That chapter also looks at Mark Lecky's work. This is Oh Magic Power of Bleakness, and this was at the Tate Britain. You'd walk into the Tate Britain and Mark had built a scale model of a kind of motorway bridge that you literally walked under. It's a motorway bridge that he used to hang out with his mates when he was a teenager in Liverpool on the Wirral. Working class kids, sports gear, sniffing glue, hanging out there. And something happened to Lecky when he was under that bridge. Some kind of entity, he says, or something passed over. And actually a lot of the practice was about trying to work out what that was about. Why was it that place? Was there some sort of connection with Neolithic burial chambers? Why did that entity come over? And what you find is that image of the bridge recurs in different genres. He builds a scale model of it. It's a massive thing in the Tate Modern. He does this magic lantern thing of his friends there. So there's something around trying to exercise a certain kind of memory, not exactly a trauma, but a memory, but also summon that memory. That meant it kind of related with Sophie Leigh Johnson's work, C.D. Viella, I thought. The other key resource and important prompt for the essays, as I've already said, was the teaching I was doing for this course of culture. And looking back on the essays, it's really that, what is that? It was a teaching situation. I mean, I'm sure it's the same as a lot of you guys, but teaching's part of my practice. It's not kind of it's not like a thing I do and then I get on with the research. It's the teaching is the work somehow. And it was also seeing the I was talking with Scott about this just earlier, seeing the kind of mental health, my own struggles with mental health, and then seeing the mental health struggles of my students, in particularly anxiety and depression, that fed into this kind of work. So I want to thank them for that. So the essays in the second half of the book are a bit more personal, or a bit more autobiographical somehow. They tackle some of the same themes, but they give a different kind of context, and they move away from academia, and they move away from the art worlds. So there's essays, for example, on performance fiction and performance, on tabletop role-playing games, and fictioning, on dreaming, on teaching and writing as factors of care and repair. Me trying to kind of fathom, but you know, I might as well be honest, me trying to work out what I value. That's what it was. It was like, what do I value? One of the chapters on archaeofictioning was about how we might use objects from the past to summon different futures. And I suppose one way I thought about these second section of essays is also trying to map out the device that I am. I suppose I had this intuition that if I wanted to really do some other work, I'd first have to thoroughly work out what I was, you know. So some of these essays in the second half are about devices that have been important to my own mental health, group work, dreaming, meditation, all sorts of things actually. And then, as I say, there was one on archaeofictioning and also some material on kind of landscape and trauma. And I tried to think about larger traumas, the Middle Passage, the Atlantic slave trade, and the burning of the witches, and how that still haunts the landscape of certainly of the British Isles, how you can kind of see that, the burning of the witches, how that's still there. You know, as Stenger says that, if you try, you can smell the smell of the burning witches. So trying to think about landscape and trauma too, and then also kind of archaeo-fictioning. And again, I wanted to look at some practices that maybe had a turn to the past as a way of going on or surviving, or an activation of objects of the past. So just a couple of examples. So I looked at the work of an artist called Verity Burt, who uses kind of animation, goes out into the north of England, to the cup and ring stones in the north of England. She does various gatherings there, and then she produces these animations and these strange props that are also in her show. But this kind of whole setup is about using images and objects of the past in order to open up other kind of possibilities. I should say that, Verity is also very interested in kind of non-human landscapes. The kind of films are really dropping down from that human perspective onto that larger field of non-human entities and intelligences, and being part of that, seeing what that was like. Or another example of what I call archaeo-fictioning, so these are these kind of terms that I come up with, is this work by Archaeo-fictioning. So Armour walked the slave trails of Ghana, the coast in Ghana, going from slave port to slave port, and at each, and she'd often walk with someone else, and at each beach, she would pick up the sand from the slave trails, and she would bring the sand back, and then she would make these objects, strange kind of like instruments or kind of devices. This one's like a filial staff with a crown on top of it, and she would encrust the sand on these objects and place them. This was in a gallery called Auto Italia, almost like on a stage, and they look like objects from a museum, like a colonial extractive museum put on display, like the British Museum. But they're also like props or objects that call to be used and enacted in a certain way to bring something about. And this is what I came particularly fascinated by, this turn to the past, producing these objects in order to perform, summon. Actually, Armour talks about these objects and some other objects which are more like musical instruments as producing a space of healing in her terms. Objects from the past, or invented objects that open up another possibility from within the world and from within the time we are. Or Neuschloss, a collective in Newcastle. The group reconstructed one of the Fulton drums and produced this kind of audio sound piece, which is a recording of the Staff Welfare Centre in Northumbria. If you work in an institution, you'll be aware of the Staff Welfare Centre. It's usually a little room no one goes to, where you go if you feel a bit sad at work. And they did a whole project about this. And what they want to do is try and interrupt and interrogate the logics of that so-called institutional care. It's a complicated piece of work. It's not straightforward. It's difficult to work out what's going on. There's this weird soundtrack, institutional soundtrack, and these odd objects. But it's something around the care of the imagination, the opening up of other possibilities. So, as is my wont, I tried diagramming this. Tried diagramming what archaeo-fictioning was, how that kind of worked, and I'm sure some of you recognise this diagram. It's from this is my version of a famous diagram from Henri Bergson's book Matter and Memory, and Henri Bergson is really trying to think through the relationship of the past to the present, or the way memories don't go anywhere. The past has not gone anywhere for Bergson. There's nowhere for it to go. Can't fall off the world. It's all around you, the past. But because you're stapled on the present moment as a sensory motor apparatus, focusing habitually on the present moment, the past doesn't manifest itself. It's not of interest to you. It's not of use. But what Bergson says is that certain things can happen on the plane of matter, which is plane of matter. Certain things can happen, and suddenly the past can suddenly arrive. And what he says needs to happen, there needs to be a pause. There needs to be, well, actually, a stopping of the world. In Jack's terms, there needs to be a halting or a pause. And I became interested in the idea that maybe objects and props could work as triggers or pauses to stop a world in order to summon another one. So I started thinking that maybe these objects could be understood as being located at that apex of the inverted cone of Bergson's cone of memory. Objects, practices, rituals that were in a landscape at certain kind of points, that when they were interacted with in a certain way, allowed something else to kind of be made present. So this particular diagram is then related to Henri Bergson's cone of memory, and also another philosopher that was really important to that Magic and Mythwork book, Gilbert Simondon. And I wasn't so interested in Simondon's account of technical objects and technicity and technical consciousness that you get carried out with Bernard Stiegler, etc. But I was interested in Simondon's almost like marginal remarks about a pre-technical consciousness, what he calls a magical mode of existence. And in various passages, he writes about how the magical mode of existence is not to do with movable technical objects, but it's to do with a kind of, well, a certain understanding of landscape and privileged sites where the exchange between man and cosmos becomes possible. It sounds very kind of strange, and it is for someone like Simondon, because there he is writing about technical objects, but it's almost like the idea that landscape is a network of privileged points where you want to enact a certain thing. So this diagram became a way of trying to think through how, in a given landscape at certain privileged points, certain kind of openings can be made possible. So another way of saying all this is that different themes, different genres, different practices were all important to me in these two books, and crossing across genre and gathering writings together. And in fact, I think this writing against genre or trying to kind of smear across different registers, I think this is what I finally found particularly interesting. A desire not to be captured by a particular genre. I think that's the important thing. But to understand what genre one was working in, what genre constitutes oneself and one's identity, and where the edges of that might be. So in this way, my essays in this book evidence a refrain in my essays that dictate that a magician must always make their own tools, must make their own devices. In order to kind of act as if, you have to make your own devices to do it. And I think that's what I was doing with the books, and to a certain extent what Plastic Fantastique was doing as well. Although if David Burrows was here sat now, he'd say, no, that's not what Plastic Fantastique, which is interesting in itself. How am I doing for time? I can end there. I've got the third section, but actually I'm happy to, I can whistle through, or we can just call that a day. You've probably got enough. Yeah, do you want to hear about the last book very briefly? Yeah, you're all like phasing out. Okay, I'll go through it quite quickly. I suppose the reason I wanted to put the last book is like a fan's book. You know, it's like an enthusiast book. It's like I've got an enthusiasm for different genres of writing. I've got an enthusiasm for theory fiction, for auto writing, for art writing, writing that plays with genre, writing that kind of performs itself, performs its content. I'm really interested in writing that's not just about something, but does it, or kind of writings that's not just about another place, but is from it or summons it somehow. Writing is a magical technology, and I think that's what this, and I will go through quite quickly what this new book was about, the last of the three. So they were like a trilogy, really. So it's a short book. I pull back a little bit and try to understand what is it I've been doing with those other works, and how do I position it or reflect on what I've been doing. And, you know, I look at these three different forms of writing practice in this book. It's really only the first two, which is theory fiction and auto writing, that are really new genres of writing in the critical humanities. The other one, art writing, is really in contemporary kind of art practice. And I like the way these writings often involve different registers besides language, besides text, the way they'll involve images or kind of drawings or kind of maps, you know, or they'll change even fonts and methods of presentation. So I go through lots of different examples of this. I look at different precursors within modernist writing, Gertrude Stein or kind of William Burroughs and so on and so forth. And I also try and identify some key works. But what I was really interested in, and what I want to kind of say to you here, I was interested in writing as itself a performance. Writing as itself kind of a performative kind of logic. What can it do? Yeah, and there's the last section of that book is actually on large language models and AI writing programs and my experiments with them. And I suppose that's an example of what Dave and I would call mythotechnesis, you know, our collaboration with writing programs in order to produce something that speaks back to us as if it's from somewhere else. Okay, so I'll just show you a few and then I'll end it. And I should say that this is all completely located in my own scene, you know, in London and the southeast of England and England. And in a way, it's very, very parochial. I'm absolutely aware that there'll be so many scenes elsewhere. I'm sure in Zagreb, I know I just had a look at the journal Some, I think someone showed me. It's a fascinating journal about theory fiction. So there's these other worlds in there. But this, I tried to write about a scene that I'm kind of part of. Because for David Burrows and myself, I think scenes are important. Not cliques, but scenes where you write for each other and you kind of part of something that generates something that's more than the sum of the individuals. It's a crucial thing for us. So briefly put, the argument is that these new modes of writing perform their content in some manner. So for example, with theory fiction, there's a kind of performing of theory or a dramatizing of theory that you often get. Or put slightly differently, there's a kind of fictioning of theory, bringing fiction to theory or performing that theory. So, you know, an example, key example for me would be Sadie Plant's Zeros and Ones, which, you know, science fiction is part of her method. You know, fiction comes in there, you know, at the beginning and the end. She writes a bit of science fiction to set it up. Throughout that book, she quotes science fiction authors. Not exactly a theory fiction book, but a book that deploys fiction alongside its theory to produce a certain effect. Have to be careful talking about Mark in a conference because it's still a bit raw. I don't know why that is, but it is. So Mark coined the term theory fiction and writes about Burroughs and Ballard and Deleuze and Baudrillard, and writes about how fiction has a kind of theory register and theory register has a fiction register, and how some fiction writers are writing theory. So this is Mark's, the latest book that's just come out, Flatline Constructs, where he really lays out that kind of theory of theory fiction. Yeah. Maybe we can go into that in the questions. I mean, it's funny for me how kind of when I write my stuff. I mean, I knew Mark was a colleague at Goldsmiths and a friend, and actually, I would like to have had a conversation with him about the weird and the eerie and my own work on landscape, but we never got around to doing that, unfortunately. Theory fiction can also involve the offering up of different perspectives, even different modes of existence, which is why it's such an appropriate form of writing for the Anthropocene or for kind of decolonization. You know, it can play with points of view and perspectives. This would be a great example, Harney and Moten's The Undercommons. You know, this is a book about the Undercommons. It's about black study. It's about collective black study against the colonial enterprise of institutions. It's about logistics. It's a book of political economy. And then there are parts in it that are just kind of channeling and poetic, like the repetition of phrases. That's particularly kind of Fred Moten stuff. There's a kind of rhythm to it. Some bits are really difficult to read. It's quite tough. Other bits are just flowing. It's a book that performs its content. It's not about the Undercommons. It's from them and helps call them forth. I know this is on every syllabus now, and I know we're probably all kind of sick to death of Donna Haraway staying with the trouble. But that last section of this book, the Camille papers, where Haraway decides she's going to kind of move into a fictional register and deploy science fiction to explore some of the concepts that she's been writing about, how to stay with the trouble, how to kind of live with the kind of disaster of the Anthropocene. And she has the device of inventing avatars, Camille, based on the monarch butterfly. And she tracks Camille's, through multiple generations, Camille 1, 2, 3, 4. And having that kind of fiction allows her to extrapolate concepts and develop them over long sequences. So again, fiction theory allows something that you wouldn't get with theory. It's kind of somehow, I know I'm going through this really fast. You're very, very polite listening to me talk about this last book. And I think, theory fiction also has resonances. It's not the same, but it has resonances with the important work of Saidiya Hartman on critical fabulation, this idea of kind of how fiction can work to address the silences and erasures of the archive. The way the archive and what gets archived is a particular kind of violence. It silences certain voices. There's nowhere to go to find that. It's been written out. So critical fabulation is a way of giving that kind of voice. Have I got 5 minutes just to finish off? I think this book has been hanging around some of the other presentations as well, actually. Preziado's Testo Junkie, which is an amazing work of kind of auto-fiction or auto-theory that tracks Preziado's trans journey, protocol of taking testosterone, but also uses the situation of a life, a situated life, to think through larger political, economic, social issues. There's kind of circuits from a local to kind of a global. It's an amazing example of kind of how an auto-register can do things that kind of a normal book on kind of theory wouldn't be able to do. And then the final register of that book is art writing. And I can't, there's so much to say about art writing, different forms of the artist's books, different ways kind of art writing works. But I thought I'd just mention Linda Stupart's book, Virus. She's a kind of colleague from nearby, and this book has got images, drawings, but also contains spells against kind of white heterosexual male artists. Great. There's a sort of comic element to it, but also it's a performance. It's got spells, text to be read out, scripts. It's just a really interesting object. There we are. Interesting object. It's like books are props. Books are props and triggers and devices. And a book like that looks back to, in fact, Stupart looks back to people like Kathy Acker, Blood and Guts in High School, which I'm sure you all know is kind of a classic example of a book that suddenly you turn a page and there's the dream maps. These crazy kind of landscapes. Turn another page and there's Kathy Acker's drawings, and then plays around with different fragmented perspectives. And art writing and theory fiction can also play around with different ideas of authorship and different kind of collaborations. For example, collaborations with non-human agents. So this was Keolado McDowell's Pharmaco AI, which was written in collaboration with ChatGPT. And I think it's one of the first book-length works that is a example of that kind of collaboration. Okay, finally then, there's also writing that kind of blurs different genres. For example, the genres between theory and fiction, a blurring of genres, the invention of new genres. One of my colleagues, Maria Fusco, says that one good definition of art writing is that each instance of art writing invents itself as a genre, which I really like that idea, these singular kind of genres. But sometimes this writing, in the case of theory fiction, works almost to bring about its own kind of reality or to set up its own scene. And I'm particularly interested in this, how a book can then have this impact of producing a scene around it and so on and so forth. Work back almost on its conditions of emergence. And I think that's probably the case with the cybernetic culture research book. And this is a book about hyperstition, about fictions having an impact on the world, about retroactive causation, reverse causation, but also a book that does that, I think, to a certain extent anyway. Yeah, and then there's also questions of kind of style and presentation and presses. I thought I'd just mention a couple. This is MA Bibliothèque, Sharon Kivlin's press in near from where I am, where she publishes artist books. And this is Urbanomic that published the Cybernetic Culture Research Unit. But, you know, I suppose in a way these presses, not so much Urbanomic, but definitely Kivlin's, they're positioned in a kind of borderland of academic writing, para-academia really. That's what it's become known as. And in a way, that diagram I showed you, where I tried to relate that to Francois Laruelle's non-philosophy project, where another way of thinking about that, Laruelle's trying to do this to philosophy. You know, cut the head of philosophy, drop it down. Philosophy with a big P, not the cavalryman off the horse. And in a way, I think there's something about dropping down that perspective that's also at stake with some of these genres. Which is also why it has such a kind of interesting relationship with exploring other forms of life, other modes of subjectivity, decolonisation. This book, M. Flesh, is a good example of that. I won't go into too much detail. Okay, so I think this links these new forms of writing, these new genres of writing that I'm interested in, to performance, more generally understood. And perhaps our Mythwork, to say it one more time, is to do with moving across genres, playing with fictions, writing fictions, claiming fictions, the deployment of them, stepping aside to let something else come through. This was the a setup that Plastique Fantastique did with our tarot cards and our cartoons and various props that were ready for a performance that was then enacted in Dilston Grove. Maybe even new becomings. I think that's it really. Thanks for listening. It's been great for me to kind of go over all that work and research around performance and mythwork. And I'm just hoping some of it has some traction with you. I don't offer this up as kind of, what I want to do was kind of share what me and this scene is doing and hoping it would have some intersections with some of what you're doing. And that would we build some relations and kind of some alliances. So it's not as if I was trying to kind of explain performance fiction, explain performance. It's almost like kind of saying, look, here are some devices. Have you got some that you can share? Can we build something together? And yeah, thank you. Can I sit on that chair? It's slightly.
Thank you. Thank you, Simon, for this wonderful, wonderful lecture. I have a lot of thoughts and questions. I guess the first thing I would like to ask, especially maybe triggered with last night's lecture by Jack, is the question of temporality, time. Because talking about Mythwork, you talk about the past, the present, and the future. So I'm just wondering how you kind of position this in regards to maybe this kind of future looking, perhaps even utopian, but of course not like a static utopia, but a more kind of situated utopian thinking. Is there something there around this?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm interested in survival. I'm interested in carrying on and kind of community and how I can survive in this world. You know, I sometimes feel very, very vulnerable, and actually, a lot of the things I value feel very vulnerable too. It feels like it can easily be stamped out by the mono world of capitalism. I've seen it happen. I think vulnerability is a key part of aesthetics. I think when Martin was talking about the aesthetic moment, I think that's also a moment of vulnerability. So what I look for is kind of, where are the places in this world that open up other possibilities for me, other possibilities of community, other values, other ways of being in the world? Where are my resources? And at least tied to this paper, sometimes I think those resources are in the past. Sometimes they're kind of objects or practices that can be activated in the present to allow a different kind of mode to come into being. So there's this sort of complicated relationship between turning to the past in order to open up future relations. And another thing to say about all that is, I have been very interested in the thought of Gilles Deleuze and Guattari, and Deleuze's idea really that kind of aesthetic practices are to do with they're future orientated. They're to do with calling forth the people. They're pitched towards the future. And really, what I understand Deleuze's meaning by that is they're kind of trying to call something forth, open something up. And maybe the last thing to say is, there's something about laying time down flat. To see times, I suppose it's a cybernetic understanding of time, to see time being connected by different loops and circuits that allows for this kind of travel that I'm really interested in. I think it's a way of kind of opening up things. That's a rather kind of roundabout answer to your question, Lucia, but it's something.
No, thank you. Yeah, I mean, it goes back to what you were talking about in your lecture about crossing these boundaries, kind of working between different modes of genres and practices, either this performative practice or writing books, obviously, this kind of more academic work, all as kind of making devices, which I find really interesting as kind of triggers to think about these new relations. I guess maybe if you would explicit what kind of power do you see in this non-belonging, in a sense that in this kind of liminal position, what kind of power is there? And in regards to also kind of more epistemological conditions, kind of different knowledge production. And finally, you talk about knots. Do you not at all together somehow?
I think it's just something I've developed that I seem to move between genres and practices, or I seem to kind of have also a different registers that I work in. Some of it, sometimes it's not really conscious, but I do think that I'm not really interested in knowledge production exactly, in the academy, what the academy understands as knowledge production. I think I've kind of realized that that's not really what I'm interested in. I'm not interested in kind of contributing towards that. I'm more interested in kind of interrupting that, or kind of finding sites outside that where other things become possible. And the other thing to say, Lucia, is I kind of follow my interests and intuition. So, for example, I'll give you an example. I mean, I've become really interested in role-playing games. This is something that I kind of, when I was about 14, I would play these games. And, for a long time in the 80s and 90s, you'd never say you were from a Dungeons and Dragons background. You get laughed out of the seminar room. But I've had my own two kids now, and they've started playing them. And I just became really interested about how these two boys, and therefore myself, could drop into these imaginary spaces and play around in these spaces that were really real for them, or flip-flopping between real and fiction, and how that had an impact on their lives outside it. It allowed them to experiment with agency and so on and so forth. And so, immediately I wanted to kind of move into those worlds. So I would, go and work and do role-playing game seminars and things like that. And I suppose another way of saying it is that kind of I'm slightly problem-driven, kind of there's something that kind of nags at me and I kind of follow it like a quarry. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned role playing. These are topics that we'll also have in the next panel. That also.
I know. I just mentioned it because I know that kind of they're going to be talking about it, so I thought I'd set that up for them.
But it's also focused on new technologies, and I was wondering, in this kind of contemporary condition, this dissolution between this, the dilution between fact and fiction, that's kind of weaponized as well. So it's, and obviously new technologies which play an important role in that have disastrous effects on culture, politics, and things like that. So yeah, how do you work in this tension? How do you kind of relate to this tension?
It's a really good question, and it's kind of an important question that Dave and I have been thinking through for kind of a number of years since we wrote fictioning, because you're absolutely right. You know, we're in a post-truth terrain or a post-fact terrain where the deployment of fictions and fictionings and hyperstitions are used by the alt-right. Just like the turn to the past, you know, a lot of the papers were about ethno-nationalisms, the turn to the past as a way of kind of reinforcing the power of the alt-right. So I think you're right. I think a lot of the stuff that I'm interested in can be taken up by the right as well. It's not a kind of simple way of saying fictioning, the fiction of the South, the turn to the past will somehow save us. And I think, you know, the way we've arrived at it with Dave and I is you look at it on a case-by-case basis, kind of what are they being mobilised for? Is it to do with obscuring, obfuscation? Is it to do with kind of certain manipulation of power? Or is it to do with kind of opening up spaces for marginalised communities, for people to be able to breathe, to go on? You know, so we look at it a case-by-case basis. And I think also, you know, it's not as if I would kind of say that I'm not thinking about the most recent books now, but fictioning. It's not as if we were ever trying to say that's the only thing. There's a place for kind of very serious work that attends to reality. You know, what's really going on beneath the fictions. So there's real work for ideological critique, for critiquing the fictions. But I suppose my intuition is that there is also a place for still for mobilising fictions, better fictions, fictions for communities, for marginalised people. That's where I am with it. Yeah.
The way you work within these kinds of new opportunities. Thank you. I will open up for questions. Okay.
Thanks so much, Simon. There are many resonances with our presentation to come, which I'm looking forward to sharing with you. One question I had is if you had any reflections on the position of the magician as a world summoner versus the mystic as a world negator or unworlder, and the implications of these two dichotomies.
That's a great question. The magician as world maker and the mystic as world negator. Is that right? The magician. That's a great question. Yeah, I thought a bit about this when Jack was talking, actually, about this relationship of negation and affirmation, you know, kind of worlding and unworlding. And, you know, Jack saying that really they'd had enough of kind of worlds and they wanted to stay with destitution. And, yeah, the kind of the mystic as a withdrawal or a negation versus the kind of proliferation of worlds. And I mean, I suppose where I am with that is that kind of any real kind of negation is also an affirmation of another world. That's where I am with that. You know, it's, you know, and any real affirmation of another world is also a negation of a previous world. And Deleuze was quite good on this. I hesitate to turn to Deleuze the whole time, but kind of he was particularly good on this particular thing. He said that he thought it was certain people were drawn towards it, he thought it was a style of life, that certain people are drawn towards affirmation and certain people are drawn towards negation as a style. And obviously for Deleuze, he's a Spinozist, and Spinoza's whole kind of philosophical system is based on joy, affirmation, as a way of kind of forming knowledge and all the rest of it. And I think in a way, you know, that's where I am. I'm kind of, my inclination is the magician, you know, the affirmation of other kind of worlds. But I think what that turn towards other worlds implies is a turning away. You know, that's what I kind of think. And yeah, I think that's the case. So in a way, I'd almost kind of be tempted to say that kind of that withdrawal or turning, or the mystic turning away from the world and the magician making worlds can be incarnated in this kind of same figure. They're two different kind of moments or movements. So, are you satisfied with that answer or not really? I mean, it's a bit like this. I don't want to kind of get into this because it's not really my place, because I'm not non-binary myself, but certainly kind of thinking about my students at Goldsmiths and this kind of idea of non-binary, there's definitely a turn away from, no, having nothing to do with that military industrial complex, patriarchy, that genocide in Palestine. They're not having anything to do with that, but they're not solely involved in negation. They're also, there's a sort of like affirmation of a completely different kind of way of being and different kind of, you know, form of existence. And I'm very taken with that. And maybe one last thing just for you guys as well, that kind of when I go to seminars and symposiums on role-playing games, as opposed to academic conferences or art conferences, I find a community there that's very open and very generous, very neurodiverse, very vulnerable. And I find that there's a home there. And I find that is a kind of really affirmation of other worlds that I'm drawn to it, you know.
Hi, Simon. You know, like in Plato's Phaedrus, the god thought brings the gift of writing to the king Tamus, and the Tamus says, like, I don't want this, because actually writing is not a memory. It's prosthetics, it's externalization, it's dangerous, and also it weakens brain. So this is like ancient knowledge. So so maybe writing is something to get rid of it, to get rid of something. So can you tell us something about this, like writing, ritual, memory? Like I'm very much interested in this relation between writing and memory, because
Yeah. Well, I mean, I'll try, Boris. I mean, I think that idea kind of writing as a prosthesis or false memory, or kind of as a supplement, you know, to speech, or it's kind of representation. But I mean, my relationship to write, I don't want to bring it down to my own experience. My experience of writing, though, is to do with kind of writing out something from the self to get a perspective on that. I don't know how else to put it, really. Writing is a bit like sometimes I kind of see tabletop role-playing games or Plastique Fantastique as a kind of landscape that I'm looking at with different figures as avatars, where I'm getting some information or I'm seeing different things. It's a kind of way of understanding who I am, my relations, where the exits are, the possibilities are, and so on and so forth. And writing performs the same role for me. This kind of, particularly the relationship I have with, I know this is dropping down to a personal thing, but the relationship I have with long form writing, I already mentioned this. There's something about having a relationship with a long form piece of writing that can often start off laying out a landscape and so on and so forth. But then as one goes and goes and goes, it starts taking on forms that weren't expected. And then your relationship with it changes. Your relationship changes with where you're suddenly having a relationship with a thing that's telling you things that you didn't know. You know, you're producing something that's of you, but it's telling something back to you. And for me, that, I think that's a key thing about writing, that it's kind of, it's from you, but it also arises from some other place. It gives information from some other place. So sure, yeah, I recognise those philosophical takes on writing as supplement, representation, you know, get rid of writing. But for me, it's a kind of, well, it's a technology of kind of egregores. You know, it's a technology of kind of making something of me that then speaks back to me. Yeah. Thanks for that question, Boris.
Okay, thank you so much for sharing your work. Just this sort of short question. I was very struck by the very start of your turn, the concept of temporal anamorphies. And then I think later you also talked in your response about temporal loops back and forth. I think I recognize some of that from the CCRU writing, but
right.
I'd be curious to hear more about time temporal anamorphies, and I just can't figure out how as well it relates to these devices or the drums in particular. If you just want to say anything about time or anamorphies. Thank you.
Yeah, so an anamorphosis in kind of representational work is a kind of, it's something that kind of breaks the logic of a particular painting or visual field. I'm sure you know this. It's kind of, so for example, that smear in the Holbein painting, there's something about how, in order to engage with what that kind of smear is, the rest of the representational system has to recede out of focus in order for that other reality to come into focus. And Lacan writes about that painting in relation to also how in that painting the anamorphosis is also another reality, the real with the big R, death coming into focus, and that's what disrupts the symbolic order of the painting. So, okay, so kind of an anamorphosis is something that kind of, could we say an anamorphosis is something that disrupts the world? It's a kind of break in a kind of visual regime, including this visual regime. It's a blot. It's a thing that doesn't make sense. But then when one adopts the correct posture, whatever that might be in relationship to it, it reveals another order of signification, another symbolic order, a deeper symbolic order. I'm rehearsing that all for myself, not for you. So I suppose, yeah, I'm interested in the idea that temporal anamorphosis might work in the kind of same sort of way. I mean, I've not really thought it through in too much detail, but for example, with the Fulton drums, what are they? They're kind of things in our visual regime. Yeah, they are in the British Museum. They're archaeological objects. There's papers written on them. There's different kind of theories about them. But there they are. They're in our regime. And is it a question that if we take on the right posture or position towards them, if we see them or engage with them in a certain way, what happens? Can they kind of conjure a world around them? A world of the dead, perhaps, of that dead child or those landscapes of the dead. So yeah, I'm playing around there with this idea that maybe I can use that idea of a spatial anamorphosis and think about it in terms of temporal anamorphosis. I don't know if it completely works, to be honest, but that's kind of one of the gambits. And yeah, the other thing about the time loops, and you're absolutely right, it's the cybernetic culture research unit. It's a cybernetic notion of time, isn't it? That there are different loops linking different kind of different times. I suppose. I mean, I don't know. I suppose my gut feeling is what allows you to go along those certain routes or follow those certain routes. What are the kind of passages? What are the kind of moments within the world that open up those circuits? And I suppose what I've been trying to develop a little bit is there might be certain objects or practices, performance or certain rituals, certain objects that do allow you to follow those circuits. And are they always anamorphic? I don't know really. I don't know. I mean, because part of me feels that plastique fantastic, again, Dave wouldn't agree with this, but part of me feels that plastique fantastic, those performances I showed you, part of me feels they've got an anamorphic logic to them. There's something around, there they are in the real, but they don't quite make sense, But if one adopts the right position towards them, all sorts of things open up. So yeah, that's a long answer. The short answer is I don't know whether anamorphosis is connected to the time looping, but I suspect it is in my I suspect it is. Are you satisfied with that? Yeah. Great question.
Now, okay, thank you, Simon, for this unfolding of your practices. It's really excellent to get into what ditches you have been crawling around in together with Deleuze and other ones. Great. But I have many questions in ways. One, Anna Kornblue came out with a book quite recently called Immediacy, where she's strongly critical to autofiction, theory fiction, proposing that sort of a culture of immediacy disqualifies reflection of different kinds. So one question that I have is sort of, how do you think about immersive in regard to art and media? In particular, in relationship to how to position imagination. Because somehow, personally, I oscillate in between thinking imagination in regard to difference and imagination in regard to immanence. Problem with difference would be that, well, then imagination is all in language, therefore the context from which I imagine will govern imagination. On the other hand, if I think imagination over immanence, my problem is I cannot not somehow also have disqualify kind of performativity, etc., because there is something that is actual to, or some form of real. So I'm curious about how you, so the struggle that we have, I believe, is exactly how to think imagination in regard of a difference in kind, or difference that are not simply transformational. And then finally into maybe something about how hyperfiction as a narrative technology that exactly doesn't tell, that is exactly not projecting the future, but generating futures.
Hello. Yeah, I'll try answering those, Martin, although they're all very, very difficult questions. And I don't know that book in immediacy, and I can sort of see how certain forms of writing, like autofiction that foreground the self, might be critiqued because they affirm immediacy over space of reflection, etc. I don't see it quite like that. I mean, as I sort of mentioned in relation to my own writing practice, there's something about kind of writing the self that opens up that reflective space and opens up that perspective. And I think, as I mentioned to you outside, I think kind of having that perspective back on the self is not a million miles away from what you understand as the aesthetic event. I think there's something similar, not the same, but something similar. In relation to imagination, yeah, I'm also interested in kind of imagination, imaginative worlds, how they interact with kind of real worlds. And I think I recognise in what you say there about imagination that's kind of difference in degree versus one that's difference in kind, and how, I guess what you're saying is how an imagination can just repeat the context, or it can repeat what came before. How can we generate something radically new? And I suppose for me, that's partly, if I'm answering your question correctly, partly what Plastique Fantastique's about. It's about trying to produce a kind of setup, a kind of fiction through what's available in the world, almost like building a platform to allow something that was unpredicted and unknown to happen. So it's almost like kind of using the sort of difference in degree, the context, what's available as a setup to allow something different to occur, something that was kind of unpredicted. That's kind of how we kind of see it. And the last bit of your question about kind of, hyperfiction, and I think this idea that fictions might bring about a kind of reality, or they might bring about their own reality. As you know, this was a kind of key thing for hyperstition, that kind of somehow there was a way of writing fictions that kind of brought about their own reality. And you see that kind of with memes, and to a certain extent, certainly for the Cybernetic Culture Research Unit, there's something about AI in place there. But just on my own, the level of my own practice, I think what I'm interested in doing is kind of producing different fictions, whether they're in writing, in performance, or different genres, that will then unfold and give me places and spaces to live and to experiment and so on and so forth. So it's almost like kind of using the methods and the tools I have available to me to bring about some sort of change in my kind of reality. I'm aware that that's a slightly woolly answer to your three quite deep questions, but that's as good as I can do.